When I was a young bloke, a 650cc bike was considered to be a big bike. If you had one of the fastest and most powerful motorcycles that money could buy. These days, however, they are classed as just a middleweight. What follows is a brief look at most of the best big production bikes from the 1960s. And if you're a British bike fan, you may want to watch until the very end, because I have a few very interesting facts which you may not be aware of. For many of us older dudes, the Norton 650 SS, which was introduced 3 years after the Triumph Bonneville, holds fond memories. The initials SS stood for Sports Special. It featured Norton's legendary featherbed frame, with a classic British-made 4-stroke overhead valve parallel twin engine. It produced 49 horsepower, and in the early 1960s, considering it had a top speed of 115 miles per hour and a quarter mile time of 14.5 seconds, it was one of the fastest and best handling motorcycles of the era. In my part of the world, it was a very popular bike for police forces. Norton also released a 750cc version, which was called the Atlas. But even though it produced more horsepower and torque, it wasn't any quicker, and apparently at high revs, it vibrated as bad as a paint shaker. Hence, the 650 was regarded to be the pick of the two. Harley-Davidson's big bike, the Duo Glide, was first introduced in 1958. Two versions of their big twin 1213cc touring bike were available. The lower compression FL, which produced 55 horsepower, and the higher compression FLH, which had 60 horsepower. It was, by far, the largest engine available in any motorcycle at the time. The bike weighed 588 pounds, and with all the bells and whistles, including a windshield, hard luggage and crash bars, it weighed 82 pounds more. It was a behemoth, but one thing about heavy bikes is that it forces the suspension to work properly. It was a supremely comfortable motorcycle to ride. Even with all this weight, it could still reach a top speed of near on 100 miles per hour and cover the quarter mile in a very respectable time of 15.8 seconds. But due to its sheer size, a few metal bits might contact the road during cornering. But it was a touring bike after all, and also popular with many police forces. If you lived in large countries like Australia or America, it was the touring bike to have. And indeed, in the early 1960s, because the 1000cc Ariel Square 4 was no longer available, if you wanted a big mile-eating touring bike, it was the only bike to have. The Duo Glide gave way to the iconic Electra Glide in 1965, which was basically a much improved Duo Glide with 12-volt electrics, an electric starter, as well as many new touring accessories. Then in 1966, Harley-Davidson replaced their already proven panhead engine with their new shovelhead motor. But even the most ardent Harley fan knows that these early shovelhead motors were just plagued with problems. In 1965, BSA also introduced their A65 650 Lightning, and it remained in production right up until the company's closure in 1972. It had a typical British 650cc 4-stroke overhead valve parallel twin engine, which initially produced 49 horsepower, with later models producing 52 horsepower. Built more as a general-purpose street bike, it was a highly sought-after machine, capable of sustained highway speeds and comfortably carrying a passenger. While it might not have been the quickest or the fastest bike, the machine's performance was nothing to be sneezed at. Its top speed was very acceptable at just over the tonne, and with a quarter mile time of 15.1 seconds in 1965, it was as fast and as quick as a Triumph Bonneville. Those who wanted a BSA with even more performance bought BSA's higher spec Spitfire version. Finished with just the right amount of chrome, a polished aluminium engine, bright red paint, and with BSA's large sunburst emblem on the tank, the bike really stood out and was visually a very nice looking motorcycle, with a sound, like all British twins with the right exhausts, that you would never forget. At the same time, the biggest, fastest and most powerful Japanese motorcycle was the Kawasaki 650 W1, which was later replaced with the W2. It was frowned upon for being a direct copy of the British twins at the time. The bike even had a separate gearbox instead of the typical unit construction at the time. This very first, big Japanese bike produced 50 horsepower, while the later and more powerful W2, which had twin carbies, produced 53 horsepower, giving the bike a top speed of 112 miles per hour and a quarter mile time of 14.5 seconds. The mechanical noise from its engine was reportedly very low compared to the British twins of the time. With its 700cc 90-degree V-twin engine cylinders sticking out each side of the bike, the Moto Guzzi V7 appeared huge compared to most other bikes of this era. Its 50 horsepower engine transferred power to the rear wheel via a 4-speed gearbox and a low-maintenance shaft final drive. It was designed with police forces and the touring rider in mind. It handled very good and had huge drum brakes, which is just as well because the bike weighed 479 pounds dry, which was considered pretty hefty back in those days. And although the Italian machine was certainly no sprinter, with a quarter mile time of just 16.3 seconds and a top speed of 98 miles per hour, making it the slowest bike on this list, it was still fast enough. The V7 was only produced for a very short time, as it was replaced in 1969 with a more powerful and faster, yet heavier and bulkier 750cc Special or Ambassador. With plenty of room for both rider and passenger, a large plush seat plus an electric starter, comfort on the V7 was reportedly second only to the Harley-Davidson Electroglide at the time. Harley-Davidsons are quite often thought of as being slow motorcycles, but back in the day, this just wasn't the case, at all. Harley first introduced their Sportster in 1957, and by the late 60s, their 883cc V-twin engine was producing 58 horsepower. That's 10 more horsepower than a Bonneville. In standard trim, the Sportster's top speed was 116 miles per hour, and it would cover the quarter mile in 13.65 seconds, which is more than half a second quicker than a Bonneville. There's a reason I keep using the Bonneville as a yardstick. More on that later. Anyway, this made the Sportster the quickest, fastest and most powerful bike available up until 1967. Even though its handling may not have been as good as the British bikes, at highway cruising speeds they were exceptionally stable, and when it came to outright performance, the Sportster really did live up to its name. They had two models of the Sportster, the XLH, which was more of a touring version with electric start, and the XLCH, which was kickstart only. And it might also surprise you to know that the Harleys made in this era, which was pre-AMF ownership, had very few equals in the motorcycle industry in regards to their build quality. Back to the parallel twins, and when the very first Norton 750cc Commando was introduced, in late 1967, things had begun to change in the motorcycle industry. Norton decided to replace their beloved featherbed frame with a brand new frame, in an attempt to reduce engine vibrations transferred to the rider. They called this frame the isoelastic frame. It featured rubber bushings to reduce the vibrations. However, they proved to have a short lifespan, and the new frame also proved weak and quickly developed problems, which included poor handling and cracking. Norton quickly solved this by adding extra bracing on later models, so if you're looking to buy a Commando, it's best to stick to 1969 models and later, as they just kept on getting better and better. At the time, the 750 Commando was a light, fast and very agile cafe racer, with very few equals. An interesting point is that it was not initially known as the Fastback until 1969, when other models started to appear. The BSA A75 Rocket 3 and the Triumph T150 Trident were basically the same bike, as at that time BSA and Triumph were brothers in arms. But BSA wanted their own version of the Triumph developed triple, and unfortunately this substantially delayed production of both models, and then their eventual release coincided with the release of Honda's brilliant CB754 and the unbelievably powerful Kawasaki H1 two-stroke triple. It was a complex corporate total balls up really, which I'm not going to get into, I'll just cover the bikes. The two major differences between the two bikes were that the engine barrels on the BSA were angled forward, which period road testers said gave the motorcycle better weight balance, while the Triumph had vertical or upright cylinders. The other major difference was that the BSA's frame was a duplex cradle frame, meaning it had two down tubes, while the Triumph version had a single front down tube. Both featured a boxy, square-looking bodywork design and a very distinctive exhaust with triple outlets on each muffler. These were later to be known as ray gun exhausts, and neither styling feature was all that popular at the time. The best proven quarter-mile time I could find for either bike was 13.6 seconds, but apparently a very well-tuned bike with the right tyres fitted could go under 13 seconds. Now, getting back to what I mentioned in the introduction of this video about a couple of interesting facts for British bike fans. The first thing is that although reported top speeds achieved for both bikes are commonly reported at anywhere from 115 miles per hour to 125, I did in fact find one period road test which clocked a standard BSA Rocket 3 at 128 miles per hour, which is faster than a Honda CB750. The second thing, and this will surprise many people, is that in 1970 an independent American dyno test found that at the rear wheel the BSA Rocket 3 produced 55.4 horsepower, while the Honda CB750 produced 53.9. I'm not going to discuss the Honda CB750 in this video, I'm just going to put its specs up, as I've covered this bike before in other videos. In 1970, the inaugural Castrol 6-hour production bike race was held. This was a race that tested every aspect of a street bike to the absolute limit: speed, handling, and reliability. The bike that won this very first race was widely considered an inferior machine to the likes of other bikes in the race, such as Honda CB750s, Norton Commandos, Yamaha XS1 650s, and many Kawasaki H1 500s. This first race was in fact won by a Triumph 650 T120 Bonneville, in a very convincing fashion, by 4 laps in fact. The Bonneville may not have been the fastest bike of the 1960s. It wasn't the quickest either. If I'd included smaller capacity bikes, this would have gone to the Kawasaki H1, even though it was just a 500. Nor was the Bonneville the best tourer. But just as the Kawasaki 900 was king in the 1970s, the Triumph Bonneville was king in the 1960s. It was the best overall motorcycle. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers, and thanks for watching.